Hello. Hi. What's up? I didn't think that I would make this video ever, actually. But I was filming a vlog for this book, and I was like, I actually do want to rant about this. Not even a rant. Rant, rave, talk about it, a book review. Maybe you've heard of this book, maybe you haven't. It was a bestseller, published in 2007, and it does have a TV show that is inspired by this book. It's historical fiction. It's not what I would normally read. I shouldn't be here, but I'm here. We're going to talk about it. Today we are talking about The Terror by Dan Simmons. I know I'm late, but I'm here, and we've got to talk about it. Backstory. This book is not something that I ever thought I would read. I watched the TV show that was inspired by the book in January, and when I watched the show, I was like, this is good. This is really good. I should read the book. And then I put it on my TBR and immediately was like, that is for another lifetime. I will read that in 10 years. And I moved on. In December, I needed an audiobook to read, and I just was like completely stuck. I had no idea what I wanted. Things were at the library. I was not sure where I was going mentally. And so I just kind of did the thing where I hit play on the audiobook thinking that I could just like convince myself that I was reading this, even though I didn't want to. And that's what happened. And so I listened to the whole thing. And I finished it this afternoon at work, and it's been driving me crazy because I have so many thoughts about it. If you've never heard about The Terror is inspired by real life events. It is not at all what actually happened because it is also supernatural, paranormal horror. I think a lot of it is based in fact. There are a lot of like real life people who are in this book who also existed in the real world. But there are obviously a lot of artistic liberties that were taken, and mostly I believe that the author wrote this to write like about a scary creature in the Arctic. So it's definitely not what happened, but like it could be what happened, like we don't know. Nobody else was there. The true events that inspired this book, it's called the Franklin Expedition. Maybe you've heard about it. It happened in the 1840s. I think they set sail in 1846, if the book is correct. And they essentially were leaving England, I think it was England, to find the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage has been found. I don't remember who found it, when they found it. I don't know anything about actual history. But I think it's near Greenland. And they went off looking for it, for real, like real people did that, and they definitely did not come home. So they got stuck out there, and I think in the book they survived for like 3 years or something like that. I don't know that they actually made it that long in the real world, but the book follows their expedition for about 3-ish years while they try and survive, try and figure out how to get home, live through a lot of drama, and also they're being stalked by a creature, and the creature is kind of like a polar bear, but not a polar bear. And so they're trying to figure out what the creature is, what does it want, why is it killing us, how do we kill it back, while also like trying to survive in the Arctic, and also like the usual like white men on ships drama. So it's like it's really unhinged, I would say. I set out to read this book thinking like, all right, I have to fortify myself. This is going to be really dry, and like it's full of terminology that I don't understand, and it's very historical, the 1800s. I don't know if I can do that. And when I started it, like from chapter 1, I was listening to the audiobook, so I don't know if that like factored into anything, but I was like instantly engaged. The first chapter, like they drop you into action. I think the first POV is from Francis, and it's like 2 years into the expedition. So like you immediately get to meet the creature. You get to see what's going on. It's creepy. It's insane. It was really, really good. Like I was shocked at how much I enjoyed it, actually. My biggest fear about historical fiction is that it's dry. I just cannot stand historical fiction for the most part because like the old times were so boring, you guys. How did they live without the internet? And I know that makes me sound like a 1990s baby, but like quite literally, where would we be without the internet? I can't tell if I enjoyed it a lot because of the book itself or because I already had the past knowledge of the show. Because here's the thing about the show. I do think it's better than the book. I turned on the show per a friend recommendation, and I didn't think I was going to like it because I have no interest in ships. I have no interest in sailing, boats, expeditions, the Arctic, anything historical like that. I have no interest in. But like the show is so brilliant because it's full of drama. The cinematography is fantastic. The acting is incredible. And it like does such a great job speaking on colonialism, and like that is kind of the whole point of the story. And it's hard to know if the author intended it as like colonialism is bad, white men suck, or like if it's like something else that's like, I am a white man and like I agree with these white men who are pieces of shit. Like I don't think that's it, especially because based on the show, like that's not what it seems like. But that is something that has been factoring into my read as well, because like I'm not out here to like worship a white man. Like we are not doing that. That is not where we're at. It's not like I look at all these white men on their ships and I'm like, oh my God, I love Francis Crozier. Like, no, actually he's an asshole. He's a piece of shit and I hate him. But like it is so entertaining to watch these men like think that they're hot shit and like they're gonna make it out alive, and like in the end, no. Most of them die. Almost all of them die. And there is cannibalism, and it is intense and scary. And yeah, it's a fun time. I had a lot of fun. I do think the show is better. I think one of the things I really do want to talk about actually is comparing the book and the show, because on the one hand, you wouldn't have the show without the book. And I understand that. But I do think the show like takes a lot that was missing from the book and puts it on a screen. And so like all of the things that I think the book is missing is in the show, and everything that the show is missing is in the book, because the book gives a lot of like explanation and details and backstory more explicitly than the show does, especially in regards to Tuunbaq and the Indigenous people and stuff like that. So like I kind of think they go together, like they complement each other well. And at the end of all of it, it's like, yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I think it's like a favorite in some ways because the story is so cool and I think about it all the time and it's very compelling. But at the same time, like I think the show is better, and I think there are things in the book that definitely need to be critiqued. And so it's like mixed feelings. Overall, I loved it. I thought it was fantastic, but I also like have mixed feelings. I'm gonna talk about it. So if you're planning on watching the show, I'd recommend going and watching the show before you read the book, just because the show is really, really good. If you've read the book and you haven't seen the show, you should watch the show. The show is really good. And if you're a secret third person who's like, I have no interest, there's nothing that you could say to make me watch this, I would please listen to my video, because I have a lot of great thoughts and this is really, really good shit. Just roll it. I have critiques, obviously. Like there are things about the book that I think should be different. But like I said, I kind of think the show like took all the bad stuff that I didn't like about the book and like made it better, because like there are very different works. The ending, everybody's ending is different, and I do think a lot of the characters develop differently in the show than they do in the book, for the better, for the most part. Because I think one of my biggest critiques about the book is that like even though we do get a lot of insight into a lot of characters, especially some of the minor characters, like there were just so many POVs that I didn't expect to see, and it's like, oh yeah, like look, there's the Jobson POV I was waiting for. Thank you. Even though we get all those POVs, and so we get to meet a lot of different characters, I don't think you get to dive as deep as you do in the show. And I think the show explored some things that the book didn't, that was really, really compelling. Like right off the bat, James Fitzjames, let's just talk about that guy. They recently found him, his jawbone, the real guy. And when they found it, they determined that he like didn't make it very far from the ship. I don't know if he was like really close to the ship or he was still on the ship, but he was like still very close. They made some kind of commentary on like when he died, and it was like pretty early on, I think, in the voyage. But the men did cannibalize him. They did eat him. So there's that. That kind of is what happens in the show, but like he definitely like leaves the ship and like travels a bit. But here's the thing. He is so different in the show versus the book because in the show, he is a gay icon. Like, not literally because we don't actually see him be gay. But, like, he cross-dresses during the carnival, and he and Frances have, like, this weird relationship where they kind of hate each other at the beginning, and then they kind of, like, have to bond together to, like, get through things after Sir John dies. And so, like, everybody talking about the show James Fitzjames is like, wow, a queer icon. But, like, book James Fitzjames is very interesting because he has a lisp, and he, like, is kind of, like, weak. He's a lot weaker than I think he is portrayed in the show. And we also really don't get that much backstory. Not that we do in the show, but, like, James has that big monologue when he and Frances are, like, trying to deliver that canister with the note in the show that talks about, like, you know, brotherhood and, like, how men like me would do anything to be seen, like, a scene of all time. And I feel like James Fitzjames in the book just, like, doesn't get fleshed out very much. He's there frequently all the time, but, like, we really don't get to know him very well. And that's, like, my biggest critique of the whole thing, because somehow the show manages to fit all these white men into this, you know, 10 episode series. And I feel like I know more of them more intimately in the show, and the backstories that they come up with are really compelling. Let's talk about Cornelius Hickey. Fucking insane character. Insane. He's crazy in the show. In the book, we really don't get to see that much of him. I thought he was going to be much more present, but he really only gets a handful of POVs, and, like, even though he's kind of, like, haunting the narrative the whole time, it isn't until, like, the end that we finally get to see him, like, act really crazy. Because obviously his whole arc is that Irving finds him and Magnus Manson, you know, doing it in the boat, in the ship. And Irving is like, I'm not going to tell anybody, but, like, stop. And so pretty much for the rest of the book, Hickey is like, we have to kill that guy because he knows what we are. And so eventually he does kill that guy. But he, like, frames it so that it looks like the Indigenous people killed John Irving, and he causes this whole thing. Frances doesn't believe him, etc. That's, like, pretty much the same thing in the book and the show. In the show, we take it one step further. We figure out in the end that Hickey, like, faked his way onto the ship. And so he's like, he's not actually Cornelius Hickey. Like, he's some other guy who just, like, got onto the ship somehow and essentially killed the real Cornelius Hickey. And I think that's just, like, brilliant storytelling. Like, that's phenomenal. I love that as a character development for him because it makes sense. And then, like, as we see him, like, go on, he does propose cannibalism, and, like, he's a crazy bitch, whatever. And, like, in the book, he does go crazy. His final POV is so interesting because he's, like, you can tell he's, like, kind of insane from something. He's not in his right mind, surely, but he thinks he's, like, invincible and he's this, like, god. And then he starts rambling and he's like, yeah, it doesn't matter that, like, my lover died. Like, I'm gonna bring him back to life. I could bring him back to life right now. I'm just not doing that, you know? And then he talks about how he controls the weather and, like, all this stuff. And he's just, like, truly an insane man. Like, he is so evil and terrible, but I think we don't get a full scope of it in the book. He's more just kind of, like, in our periphery, and you're like, like, that guy's creepy. What is he doing? Why did he kill John Irving, you know? Whereas in the show, you really get to see, like, deep into Hickey's character, and it is so crazy. Like, it is so well done, and I wish we had gotten that in the book. And so, like, there's a couple more characters like that where I'm like, okay, like, you obviously are important to the story because we get your POV and we get to see you develop a little bit, but most of the development is off page, and it's so frustrating. Another example, my favorite duo, my favorite people, John Bridgens, Harry Peglar, the gays of all time. In the show, they are just so perfect. They're so phenomenal, because you don't really get, like, a lot of time with them, but, like, they drop in, like, just enough to show, like, they're exchanging books throughout this voyage, and, like, you don't really see them do very much, but, like, their hands touch, and, like, that's important. And so they, like, have this relationship that, like, they build it up over the course of the episodes that, like, you see it, you just don't really get to see it. And so even though that one also is, like, kind of off screen, it still feels present somehow. And so by the end of it, like, you don't have a lot, but it felt like there was more than we got in the book, which is, like, you know, like, maybe 2 or 3 POVs where you get to see Peglar kind of explain, like, oh, I met this man and I knew he was a sodomite, and, like, he started teaching me how to read, and then, like, we had an affair, and then, like, we stopped doing that, and so now we're on this ship and we are not doing that. However, like, by the time they get to the end of their journey, they kind of have one moment where they're like, okay, like, I do love you. Like, you are my loved one. At one point, Bridgens talks to Pegler and he's like, I don't have anybody, like, you are my loved one. I would give this to you because you are my loved one. I don't have anybody else, you know? And so they have this like beautiful, tragic love story, but like, again, it's barely explored. There's really not much on the page. You kind of have to do a lot of work in your brain. And so on the one hand, that makes the Terror great because there's so many possibilities for like fanfic or like daydreaming about the Blorbos, like whatever. I'm not really a fanfic person, so like, not to out myself, but I want it on the page. I'm sorry. I would like it on the page and I would like it in the book because that is why I'm reading the book. And so like, I think it was frustrating because I knew what we had in the show, and like, I can understand how it would be different, you know, like in the show, Harry Goodsir and Lady Silence, Silna, have a relationship. And in the book, the person who has a relationship with her is John Irving. And so I can understand why you would want to do Harry Goodsir instead. It makes a little bit more sense in some ways. And I like the way that they explore that relationship in the show. Like, it's fine. It's all good. We can have separate books, separate works. But I think the show just did a better job of it. Yeah, I will say the part where the show fell short is Tuunbaq. I do want to talk about Tuunbaq. Tuunbaq is my best friend. I love him so much. Her, it, they, she. I think it's upsetting that the CGI in the show is so bad and that they didn't even really pay attention to any of the descriptions in the book, because in the book, it's like, it's this creature that is like 12 feet tall and it like hides in the snow and the fog. And so you really can't see it until it's like right up on you, and it has these like big black eyes and its neck is really long and it kind of looks like a polar bear, but it's not really a polar bear. And so like, there's been some really fantastic art actually that I've found on Tumblr for Tuunbaq that I'm like, now that would have been great in the show. But alas, they have whatever the fuck that was. And I think it's also interesting because in the show, Tuunbaq dies. I think it gets killed or it dies because of lead poisoning, because it's eating all of the men and the men have lead poisoning. But in the book, Tuunbaq survives, and it's really, it's interesting because, full circle, Francis Crozier, he does survive and he does make it out, and the only reason he survives is because of Lady Silence. And so she kind of like nurses him back to health and takes care of him, and eventually, like in the book, they end up becoming married and they have children, and they kind of like join the indigenous people that Lady Silna, Lady Silence, is from. And so like, because of that, because they're like rejoining that society, Francis Crozier essentially like steps into his identity as like a shaman, ? Is that what they're called? I couldn't remember when I was listening to all of it. But he has the second sight. And so like, it's kind of implied that he is part of their bloodline and that Lady Silence was like waiting for him all this time. And eventually he just like, he actually accepts his bloodline, and so he communes with Tuunbaq, and he and Tuunbaq are now like part of the thing, and like Lady Silence is also there. And so like, it's really kind of insane actually, because in the show, you know, Tuunbaq dies, Lady Silence kind of gets like ostracized from her community because she lets this happen. And so it's like this really crazy thing where Crozier kind of like joins the indigenous people and learns how to like live off the land, but he's like really not with Lady Silence, and Lady Silence is like isolated and on her own. And Tuunbaq is dead. And so it's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's like, okay, like I could understand that ending. That makes some sense. In the book, it's like Francis is a part of their community, and also he and Lady Silence develop this like really intense, deep relationship where they love each other and they have children together and they survive together, and both of them can commune with Tuunbaq, and they have this power where they can like read each other's minds and they see each other's dreams. And so like, a lot of it comes down to like the world building of this like indigenous people and like all the folklore that's involved, and like whatever Tuunbaq is, because Tuunbaq is like this mythological beast that like was created with ill intent. And so like, in order to like save humanity or whatever, like these shaman or these what are they called, like real ones or something like that, these people, this like group of indigenous people essentially like commune with Tuunbaq and like make this pact where they're like, we will not like enter your land as long as you spare us, and like we'll like be nice to you if you're nice to us, kind of thing. And so the whole reason all of this happens in the Terror is that the white men like trespass on the Tuunbaq's territory. And that's really not explained in the show. And so it's like a little bit more difficult to understand what's happening on screen because it's not explicitly shared. And they're kind of learning things from Lady Silence as Harry Goodsir kind of like decodes her language and stuff like that. And so in the book, she can't speak at all. She already lost her tongue. But I think it takes a while in the show for her to actually like lose her ability to speak. And so it's like, it's interesting to see the differences, whatever. I don't love how Frances Crozier's story plays out in the book. Like, I don't know what about it feels wrong, but it's weird, you know? And the second sight thing was really, really weird for most of the book because about halfway through, he starts getting these visions and he's like, I've always had these visions. And so he's talking about his aunt or a family friend, Memo Moira, and he keeps having these visions and then he gets headaches and like it's this whole big thing. And so it's like he's destined to like meet his people or whatever. And like and then they talk about souls at one point, like because every soul, like souls get reborn, and like part of why Lady Silence's people is capable of hunting in that environment is because they like respect the animals and the souls in the animals, and like it's this whole thing. And I do like the concept of it, and I think like if I had more commentary from the author, I would be able to like figure out how I feel about the whole thing, because I am like very conscious of like, is it cultural appropriation? I don't really know. I'm not sure. I don't have my thinking cap on to fully comprehend. And it's not for me to say. I'm just a little white girl. As far as like craft and world building and story goes, like it was really interesting and really impressive, and I think it like added this layer to the story. Like this is why the show is good and why I like the book so much, is that like it does make a lot of really interesting commentary on colonialism and the fact that like you should respect the land and like you should respect the indigenous people, because like they actually are like definitely way smarter than us, and they like have developed all of these really cool techniques. Like I think one of the most interesting things about the end of the book is like for most of that whole journey, Crozier and his people are like, man, if we just met some indigenous people, like they'd show us how to live off the land, and like we don't know how they're doing it, but Lady Silence keeps getting food, and like she's fine in this ice hut, and like we don't understand how they work. And he finally like gets to see like under the veil, like what are these people doing that they can survive in the fucking Arctic and they don't have any problems whatsoever, you know? And so we see Lady Silence like building their like sledge and building their like ice home, and it's fascinating. And so he clearly did some research, because like all of it, I was like, it all makes sense, and like scientifically and historically, I'm sure that's exactly like similar to what they did in the real world. But like I never would have thought of that, and like that's really genius. And like I can't believe you can just like survive in an ice hut and be sweating. Like that's crazy. It was really interesting. And this it reminds me a lot of the scene with John Irving when he does meet that group of indigenous people, because like I don't think he really has the best intentions, because he's kind of a piece of shit. And obviously he does not survive by the end of it, but like seeing him try and interact with these indigenous people, and the indigenous people kind of are like, oh, like you're hungry, we have food, like we'll share our knowledge with you, we'll barter, we'll trade, whatever. And it's like, I think the whole reason why Terror is such an interesting story and a compelling story, whether it's the show or the book, is like the whole point of it is humanity. You know, like what would you do in a situation where you have to survive with other humans? You're lost in the Arctic, you have no food, you're whatever, lost. And like at the heart of it, like I think it really comes back to this scene with Frances Crozier in the book, where like he has spent so much of the book drinking himself to death essentially, and he feels so terrible that he always is like, yep, when I'm done with the whiskey, I'm going to kill myself, and that'll be the end of it, and thank God for that. And he actually like reaches this point where he's like, nope, never mind, I do want to live, we should do everything we can to live. And it's like, even when these men clearly are like at the end of their rope, like they all know they're gonna die, they all know that they don't have any food left, they can't survive, they still are like, well, we gotta, like, what do we gotta do to at least like try? How do we give ourselves better chances? Like, how do we do something, anything to survive? And it's really crazy, because like I wake up in the morning and it's cold outside, and I'm like, man, this is awful. I don't want to keep doing this ever again. And I literally have to be like, there were men in the Arctic 200 years ago. It was negative 60 degrees outside, and they still got their asses up to like, I don't know, fucking manage a boat. That's another thing that's so compelling about that time period and those men, is that like honor is like such a strong thing for them, and the life that they know is so dictated by like being in the Navy or being in the military or being on a ship like that. And so like, no matter what, they're still like, well, we got to like play by the rules of the game. You know, like he is my commanding officer. Like I can't disrespect him. I can't use the F word in front of him, even though we're at the very ends of the earth and I'm going to die in like 3 days. I cannot curse in front of him. I'm so sorry, Captain. Like, it's so funny, but like, that's how they lived. And it's really compelling. It's crazy. It's so entertaining. So anyway, all of that to say, parts of it dragged, and there are things that the show definitely did better. Character-wise, story-wise, I do think because the show was made in 2018, like, it does kind of have a different tone. Like, 2007, and also it's imitating 1800s speak. Like, there's just, like, a lot of racism and sexism and whatever. And, like, there's one part I remember specifically. It's a Francis Crozier POV, and I think it's one where he and Sophie... Is that her name? Sophie, whatever. The girl that he's interested in London, like they have kind of sex in the pond, question mark, the platypus pond. I don't know, but he's talking about his woman, and he like makes some kind of comment where he's like, obviously like women can't have orgasms, like they're only here to pleasure men, like duh, that's common knowledge. And so it's like shit like that where it's like a passing comment of like, yes, obviously white people are better than indigenous people, that's crazy, and they call them Eskimos and like whatever. And so it's like, yeah, it's hard to read. It's a little unsettling. There were a lot of things that were said that I was like, damn, like that's crazy. Why the fuck would you say that? It is historical. And so it's that age-old thing where it's like, do you write history the way that it is because you're trying to like tell a historical story? Or like, can you write about a historical time period without including the hateful speech that spurred on that period? This story is so unique and interesting. This story is so interesting because it is like, it seems to me that it's like making commentary about colonialism and how white people suck. And so it's like, if the argument you're making is that white people suck, you should probably like give examples of like how white people suck. And like that, this book did that. Like by the end of it, I was like, man, white people really are the worst. Like I knew that, but it's apparent by the end of this that it's like, somebody's really gotta like kill us. Like we should not be alive. We are the worst. So at the tail end of all of it, I guess like I was shocked at how entertained I was. I think that's it. I cannot believe that I read this book and I enjoyed it, and I was really riveted actually. Like there were certain parts where they talked about like the specifics and like terminology and like how to like run a boat and an expedition and all that stuff. And there were like multiple times, actually, this is just a random sidebar, there were multiple times throughout the book where they kind of have to like pause and be like, okay, let's remember where we started and where we are now. And so they'll be like, here are all of the officers that we've lost thus far. And like the first time it happens, you're like, cool, okay, we lost like 2 people, like that sucks, let's move on. And then it happens like more than once where you're like, I know, I was there when Lieutenant Graham Gore died, I remember him, can we stop talking about it? And it was also really funny because like the more people that died, the more they had to like hand off certain like jobs or whatever. So they'd be like, yeah, this guy, he has no training, he has never been like in command before, but like he is making decisions because he's the only guy living. Like I think at the very end there's a POV for Charles DeVoe maybe, and they're like, you're captain now. And he's like, well, shit, I can't do this by myself. I need help. I need you guys to tell me what to do. It's really unsettling towards the end because like you start to like put yourself in these shoes of like, like having scurvy. And so they're talking about like, yeah, like we're floating on our boats and we're trying to find a lead in the ocean. And so we're not like on land, and they have to figure out how to have their explosive diarrhea while on a boat. Like a little boat, not like a big ship, just like on a boat. And so that's like a fun thing to think about. I will say, I think one of the saddest deaths is Jobson. I'm still very compelled by Jobson's death. And I think I love how they told his story in the show because they actually fleshed him out as a character, and like they really played up on his relationship with Crozier, because his whole arc is at the end, he gets really sick, and on his birthday, he turned 31, and on his birthday he like becomes cognizant, and he's like, oh my god, are the men leaving me right now? All of the guys like the previous chapter had planned to like get in these boats because they thought they saw a lead, and so they're like, well, if anybody who can walk, who can make it to the boats, like, we will take them with us. But if they can't walk on their own, like, we're leaving them. We're just going. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense logically. Like, you shouldn't drag around all these sick guys. But Jobson literally, like, becomes conscious when they are leaving. And so he's, like, crawling to get to them. And the whole time he's like, I'm only 31. It is my birthday. Why am I an old man? Why are they leaving me? They can't leave me in the Arctic. And all the while he's, like, crawling, and he knows that, like, he won't be able to get back to the tent. And so he's not going to be able to stay warm, so he's going to die if he keeps crawling, but, like, he has no choice, and so he tries calling for them, and then they don't hear him, and then it's like, okay, well, he's dying. And in the show, they have this really fantastic scene where he is crawling, and he's just, like, you know, crawling on the ground trying to reach his people, but he has this, like, hallucination where he's crawling across a dinner, like, a feast. And at the other end of the table is Francis Crozier, and he's, like, not paying attention to Jobson. And so, like, we've established that Crozier really cares about Jobson, and he would never just, like, leave him. But Jobson doesn't know that Francis Crozier was, like, taken and attacked by Hickey, and so, like, all this stuff. And he just thinks that, like, Crozier left him to die. And he's so angry while he's, like, crawling to get away. Oh, my God. It's insane cinema. It's such a good episode. In the book, you don't get the build up to that POV. They just kind of, like, drop you in Jobson's POV, and it's like, yeah, it's upsetting and it's really sad, and, like, the whole thing is just terrible to read because you start thinking about, like, what if I was the person that they left behind in the Arctic? And it's like, yeah, all those men died. It doesn't matter that they left him because they died a little bit later. Like, we don't get to see any conclusion about what happened to those guys. It's just assumed that everybody is dead at some point. But it's like, knowing that you were one of the ones left behind like that, brutal. And I will say, I think one of the most beautiful deaths of all of them, I feel like I'm, like, on, like, a reality show. It's like, okay, like, Hunger Games style, like, who died best? But John Bridgens, like, what a man. I didn't really get to talk too much about Peglar and Bridgens. I do love them a lot, but I think Bridgens is such a beautiful death because there's one point when he's talking to Peglar, and Peglar is like, I'm gonna die before you, and he says it, you know, as a way of, like, like, I love you, like, you can't die before me kind of thing. But, like, Bridgens is much older than Peglar, and so he's like, that's stupid, I'm literally gonna die first, like, don't even say that. Obviously Harry Peglar dies first. He gets killed by Tuunbaq, R.I.P. And in the show, I think he dies from scurvy, but all of this happens, and Bridgens, you know, like, carries on, and it's very sad and whatever. But eventually, by the end of it, Bridgens reaches a point where he's like, cool, that's nice, I'm done. And so he, like, takes Peglar's journal with him, and he's like, I'm just gonna take a walk. And so he just, like, goes for a walk, and then he lays down to go to sleep, and that's the end. And oh my God, it's insane. In the show, it's such a beautiful shot because they have the sunrise coming up, and he, like, lays down, and whew, it's just so good. But in the book, like, you know, it's kind of the same deal, and it's like, it's tragic and it sucks and it's so sad, but, like, at least I feel like he is one of the ones who had the most agency in his death, and, like, beautiful agency. Like, Good Sir had agency, but he really just, like, killed himself so that, like, Hickey and the rest of them, like, couldn't eat him and, like, couldn't cannibalize anybody else, and so it's a way more fucked up. I will say I loved watching John Franklin die. Every time he dies, it is so compelling because he thinks he's hot shit, and he literally doomed all of those men. So I hope he's rotting in hell somewhere. I'm done talking your ear off. I could probably talk for hours and hours about this because it is so rich. There's just so much to talk about. Hopefully I, like, either compelled you to go watch the show, or you have already read the book and want to talk about it. I don't know. Nobody's gonna watch this but me, but I feel better. So that's what my YouTube channel is for, everybody. Anyway, thank you for watching if you made it this far, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye.